Well, we've talked a lot in recent weeks about what the US economy is going to look like in 2021. But what about the global economy? Mohamed El-Erian is the senior global fellow at the Lauder Institute for Management and International Studies at the Wharton School. He's also chief economist at Allianz and president of Queen College, Cambridge. And a pleasure to have him back on our show. Mohamed, great to talk to you again. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So before we look ahead, let's kind of look back to 2020, and certainly the global economy has had a lot to deal with. How do you view the state of the global economy as we end this year?
So if the state of the global economy were a patient, we are still in ICU, but we have a clear path not only to recovery, but to getting out of the hospital. We're still in ICU for a fundamental reason that the liberal democracies, think of the US, think of Europe, have not as yet been able to balance three competing priorities. One is public health. Two is as normal economic and social interactions as possible. And three is individual freedom. And because we haven't been able yet to do this, we are having a little bit the worst of all worlds. We're having high hospitalizations and deaths related to COVID. We're having restriction on economic and social interactions. And we're having people feel that their individual freedoms have been impinged on.
The word resilience is obviously used quite a bit when you think about economies. And I'm wondering that even with all of the negative impact that we have seen in 2020, it seems like that there's a level of resilience that has been there that, to a degree, has maybe even made this, prevented this from being worse than it possibly could have been.
Yes and no. So certainly there's an element of resilience that we should celebrate. There are countries that have been able to turn the corner. Think of the Chinas, Taiwans, the New Zealands, the Australia of this world. They've been able to do so. There's also been resilience in the corporate sector. We have seen actually companies go from strength to strength. Think of big tech. And most of all, we've seen resilience in financial markets. It is astounding to quite a few people how well financial markets have done. And there are different reasons for that resilience. And most importantly, we have seen resilience in human activity and great acts of kindness. But against that, we have seen sectors that have been suffering tremendously. We have seen an enormous rise in what I call the inequality trifecta. The inequality of income, wealth, and the inequality of opportunity. We have seen very long lines, unimaginably long lines at food banks, telling you that there's still a significant amount of pain and suffering, that people didn't have enough household financial security. And of course, we have seen the health system come under tremendous stress with ICU capacity coming down. So yes, overall, we've seen resilience, but unfortunately, it hasn't been shared by all segments of the population.
So as 2021 gets started, what do you see playing out on global economies, especially with a lot of those elements still being a part of what we're going to be dealing with for the next few months?
So I suspect that we'll have two halves or two parts to 2021, with the determining factor being when do we get to broad vaccine adoption. The first part is the square root sign, is the flat sign of the square root. We went down sharply, we came back a little bit, and we're going to flatten out. And within that, as I mentioned earlier, you'll have countries that are doing fine, and there are other countries that are going to still be in recession. Europe is likely to be in recession in the first quarter of 2021. So there's going to be one component where the global economy as a whole is flat, with the balance of risk on the downside, but massive differences in countries. And then the second component will be a much more pronounced recovery that is shared by most countries. And it will be led by the advanced economies and certain developing countries. And that will be based on returning to more normal economic functioning. There's a massive amount of pent-up demand in the system that once we overcome what I call the human counterparty risk, the ability of you and I to interact and the ability for us to do normal things again, we can unleash quite a strong economic recovery. But that's going to come only after we have a sense of community immunity or herd immunity.
So obviously, as a lot of people are starting to talk about that buildup of recovery in 2021, I'm even hearing more and more conversation about 2022 and maybe 2023 and beyond as maybe the years where we really truly see this growth start to kick in.
So ironically, the further out you go, the more difficult the prediction becomes. Why? Because we're not sure how much scarring is happening. What is scarring? It's this notion that short-term problems, a wound, okay, they don't heal. They become long-term problems. So you can think of a company that has liquidity problem. It has a viable business, but ends up in bankruptcy. That's a very different proposition for the economy. You can think of people coming out of high school that don't get a job in the first year, which is the case for 2020, and then cannot get a job later on. And suddenly you go from short-term unemployment to long-term unemployment to that horrible concept of permanent unemployment. So the big question will be what's the balance between the inherent recovery and dynamism of an economy that now has a green light on health relative to the scarring or to the damage that we incur in the short run.
I wanted to also ask you about the Chinese economy because that's obviously a country that is drawing more and more attention these days and the growth that economy has had in recent years. Do you see that continuing for the foreseeable future?
They certainly are going to be the outperformer because go back to my basic equation, public health, economic, social interactions, and individual behaviors. What China is able to do that the US cannot do is impose certain behaviors on the individuals. So if you think in terms of equations, rather than solve a complicated 3-variable equation, China's solving a 2-variable equation. And you and I know that a 2-variable equation is easier to solve than a 3-variable equation. So China will be the outperformer. In fact, already in 2020, it will be one of the few countries that will show a positive growth rate in 2020. Think of +2, +3 relative to anything between -4 and -16, 17 for the advanced world. But the big question is the longer term. Can China operate without the tailwind, the strong tailwind of the global economy? Because it's not going to have that for a while. And that really comes down to, can it accelerate its domestic reforms?
With all of this that's been going on in the last few months, I think to a degree we've forgotten, at least looking at Europe, there's still Brexit. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as we go through 2021.
Yeah, absolutely. And even today, there's no clarity. We are a good 4 years plus after the referendum, and there isn't clarity to what the post-Brexit world looks like. And I think what the UK is discovering, and other countries have as well, is you cannot replace something with nothing. It's easier to dismantle something. We can all agree on let's dismantle this, but it's much harder to agree on what to build instead. And when building instead involves other countries and involves a decision-making process that Europe itself will admit is complex, I don't think it's a surprise we are where we are, but yes, that will be another uncertainty that the global economy and Europe in particular, and the UK most of all, has to deal with.
How do you think emerging markets are going to be doing in 2021 as we move ahead?
So it's been the tale of two cities, the Charles Dickens, the start of that book, the best of worlds and the worst of worlds. The best of worlds for emerging markets, which I suspect will continue, is very easy access to external funding for most countries at very, very attractive levels. And they have the central banks to thank for that. But if you are the typical emerging economy, this is what you're dealing with. Lower export demand because the global economy is struggling. Virtually no tourism at all. A hit in workers' remittances, a hit in aid, and a hit in foreign direct investment. So if you were to do like the Olympics and judge the degree of difficulty in terms of a certain thing you're trying to do, on the policy front, the degree of difficulty facing emerging economies and developing countries in general is considerably higher than for the advanced world.
If I can, as we wrap things up, I wanted to bring it back here to the US and talk about the Federal Reserve, if we can, for a moment. And if you go by some of the recent statements by Jerome Powell, the expectation is that the pattern of accommodative policy is going to continue for the foreseeable future.
That's absolutely correct. You know, increasingly, whether you look at the Federal Reserve or whether you look at the European Central Bank, it's increasingly looking like what one of my former work colleagues, Chris Down, has called the no exit paradigm, that you simply cannot get out of this policy paradigm because even thinking about it means that you could destabilize markets. So it comes as no surprise to me that the Federal Reserve keeps on guiding forward that it will remain low for very long, that it will continue buying assets for very long. And the hope is you'll get the policy handoff. You'll get a handoff to more fiscal and critically more pro-growth structural reforms that allows the Fed to exit slowly in an orderly way. But for the next year or two, the Fed simply cannot get out of this paradigm it finds itself in.
So then are there things that the Fed should be aware of, or maybe tools that they may need to just have ready to go just in case? And maybe even, as you mentioned, the ECB, but other central banks around the world.
Yes, absolutely. You know, if you had told Ben Bernanke in 2010, when he initiated the use of unconventional policies for broader economic outcomes, if you told him that we'd still be doing it in 2020, he wouldn't have believed you. And I suspect he would have thought twice about the policy move. Why? Because he himself in 2010 was very forward-looking and saying it depends on, quote, benefits, costs, risks. And the longer you're in this policy paradigm, which of course he had no way of knowing how long we're going to be in it, but the longer you're in this policy paradigm, the lower the benefits, the higher the cost and the higher the risk. And I think we have crossed the line where the costs and risks are much higher than the benefits. So you've got to think as a central bank as to what else you can do to make that equation less unpleasant. And there's a few things you can do and you must do. One is what's called prudential policies. Is recognize that a lot of excessive and irresponsible risk is building up, but it's not building up where you normally look in the banking system. It's happening in the non-banks. So you've got to massively improve your understanding, supervision, and regulation of the non-bank sectors with others. Two is your communication. You cannot continue to condition markets to think that the central banks are the BFFs, the best friends forever. You've got to sort of condition markets that is a time-specific paradigm that will revert, and they have to prepare. And thirdly, a lot more cross-border policy coordination.
Mohamed, as always, great to talk with you. Thanks very much for your time and your insight. All the best.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year, everybody.
Mohamed El-Erian, Senior Global Fellow at the Lauder Institute at the Wharton School, Chief Economist at Allianz, and President of Queen's College, Cambridge.